Good evening, everyone. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Hello, friends. Good evening, and welcome to History Happy Hour, Sephardic Jewish Migration to Indianapolis. My name is Lauren Pichtel, and I am the Manager of Genealogy and Cultural Programs at the Indiana Historical Society. It's great to see so many of you here tonight. This happy hour is brought to you with support from One America Financial Partners, a national provider in the insurance and financial services marketplace. At the Indiana Historical Society, we are Indiana storytellers, connecting people to the past. We do this by collecting millions upon millions of pieces of paper that tell Indiana's unique stories, things like books, paintings, letters, photographs, diaries, maps, and more, and finding intriguing and unexpected ways to share and remember the past, whether that be through publications, exhibitions, or events like tonight. It is through these pieces that we tell the diverse, unconventional, and even saucy stories of Indiana, and to inspire a future grounded in our state's uniting values and principles. Tonight, we're going to trace the origins of one group of people who have called Indianapolis home for over a century. But before I introduce Callie, our moderator for this evening, a few pieces of Zoom logistics. For this event, Callie and Sue will chat for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to your questions. If you have a question at the end or as we're going along, please drop it in the question and answer section. We'll keep an eye on them and then pepper them in as we get to the second half of our program tonight. You have all been muted this evening, but we do want to hear your thoughts. Add comments to the chat box as we go. Make sure you are replying to panelists and attendees so everyone can see your reply. Also, keep an eye on it for links and URLs. Don't worry if you miss one. Most of the links will also be delivered to your inbox in a follow-up email tomorrow morning. This program is being recorded. You can catch the reply on our website, indianahistory.org, in the upcoming week's replay. If you enjoy this program, please consider coming back for more. Join us for more History Happy Hours. Next week, September 17th, we're back exploring Indianapolis's evolving transit with urban planner Austin Gibble, archaeologist David Kling, and architectural historian Leah Connick. And keep an eye out for upcoming conversations on cemeteries, Kurt Vonnegut, wedding fashions, elections, and more. Sign up for that at indianahistory.org for more information about this and other virtual offerings coming to an internet-connected device near you. Without further ado, let me introduce you to Callie McCune, Manager of Public Programs at the Indiana Historical Society, to get us started.
Thanks, Lauren. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here tonight and talk about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, the Sephardic Jews, and especially those that came and lived in Indianapolis. And it's my pleasure to be able to introduce and share the conversation tonight with Dr. Sue Hyatt, who I love having conversations about this topic with, and I think we could go on and on all day long and just kibitz about Jews in Indianapolis. If you haven't gotten a chance to meet Sue yet, you should, especially when we can open up and see everybody again. And Sue's the chair of the anthropology department at IUPUI, and she's also the founder of the Neighborhood of Saturdays program, which project, which looked at the relationship between the Jewish community and African American communities on the south side of Indianapolis. And this is a community that kind of got a little bit wiped out by the highway coming in, but those relationships are still pretty strong, and Sue's been able to kind of bring them back and mend them again. So thanks so much for being here today with us, Sue. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, we're really excited to talk about this topic with you. And it's something that you and I think, have talked a lot about in varying times. But we wanted to start with a little bit of a history's mystery for tonight. So I'm sharing a picture of census data from Indianapolis from 1920. And it's a little weird because it's a little hard to see, but in the highlighted portion, the person says that were born in Turkey, but they speak Spanish. So what's that all about, Sue?
Well, thanks, Callie. Yes, looking at the census data, we did uncover a history mystery, which we were able to solve. And when people said that their birthplace was Turkey and their tongue was Spanish, they're actually referring to somewhat different concepts. When they list their birthplace as Turkey, that's actually in reference to the Ottoman Empire, which at the time, of course, was ruled by Turkey, but was a very multi-ethnic and multinational empire. And when they talk about Spanish, they're actually talking about a variant of Spanish or a dialect of Spanish called Ladino. Now, our story begins in 1492 on the Iberian Peninsula. And the King and Queen of Spain issued what was called the Edict of Expulsion. And that mandated that Jews living in Spain and Portugal, and there were quite numerous communities at that time, that they had to either accept Catholicism and convert, or they had to leave. So many of them fled and scattered to various parts of the world, but they received a very welcoming and warm invitation from the then Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, who invited them to come and settle there.
Gotcha. So Jews are fairly diverse people. So most of us, when we think about Jewish people, we think that they're coming from like Poland, right? Or Germany, or maybe Russia. So they're Jews all over the world though, right? And how are maybe the Jews from Spain different than the Jews from Europe?
Well, that's a great question. There are many ways that communities identify themselves, and the labels that we use for describing different communities, no matter what that community is, they're always a little vague and a little bit inaccurate. But the two big groups that we talk about in the US are the Ashkenazi Ashkenazim and the Sephardim. The Ashkenazim are people like my family who come from Eastern Europe, as you said, Russia, Germany, sometimes other parts of Western Europe other than Spain. And they left those places and brought with them a language that we know as Yiddish, which is a form of medieval German mixed with words from the languages that they encountered in the places where they lived. The Sephardim, Sephardic means Spanish, and the Sephardim originated from Spain and Portugal, and when they fled, they brought with them a language called Ladino, which we might hear a little bit of in a few minutes. And if you speak Spanish, you will understand Ladino, but it's from a medieval form of Spanish mixed with other languages from the countries where the Sephardim settled, which tended to be the Middle East, North Africa, and Southern Europe.
Gotcha. So when Sephardic people come to Indianapolis, where do they come from?
Well, the first Sephardic people who settled here in the early part of the 20th century, they came from two cities, which is really interesting because I don't know any other community where we can really trace the original settlers back to just two cities. And these two cities were very connected to one another. One was called Monastir in the Ottoman times, and that is now known as Bitola, and now it's in the country we know as North Macedonia. And Salonika today we call Thessaloniki, and that's in the country that we call Greece. But they're very close to one another, and there was a lot of traffic between those two cities. Salonika was at one point in the late 1800s and early 1900s was 70% Jewish. It was a very cosmopolitan Ottoman city. It was very multi-ethnic, and Jews occupied a really important niche in the economic um, um, order. The monastir community was much more rural, much more poor, and people tended to not be as educated or as affluent as the people from Salonika at that time.
Gotcha. So you talk about how they were this important part of the community. It was like we're 50% of the population. Why did they decide to leave and come to Indianapolis? It seems like an odd choice, right?
Well, like most people who migrate, they didn't really decide. What happened was, under the Ottoman rule, there was really a very high tolerance for multi-ethnicity and for religious diversity. Once we started getting into the run-up to World War I, the outbreak of the Balkan Wars in 1911 and 1912, and then the movement into World War I, we had the formation of what we now know as nation states. So those are countries that we know today, for example, as Turkey and Greece. And once nation states started forming, they got an idea of who was authentically Greek and who was authentically Turkish. And Jews and Muslims, for that matter, no longer really fit into that. And so there started to be discrimination, which had not really existed in great levels before under Ottoman rule. So people started to flee. Also, Jewish boys had been exempt from serving in the Ottoman army. They paid an extra tax and they weren't expected to serve in the army. But after the Ottoman Empire began to break up, then they were expected to serve in the army. So they thought maybe it was a good time to depart.
Gotcha. So they come here to Indianapolis, and what do they do? Because I
Well,
was surprised that they all kind of did the same thing to start with, at least.
well, some of them did. If you want to go to the next slide, maybe I think we have a slide about that.
Yeah, here we go.
Okay, so the group from Monastir we refer to as the Monastirlis, and this is an article that says we don't really know why the first people came, and maybe we don't, but maybe we do, and I'm going to give you a hypothesis about that in a minute. But this author of this article mentions the Jacob and Rachel Sephardi Toledano, and you can hear the Spanish surname Toledano. And she says that they came in 1906 from Monastir. Now, one day I was at the Sephardic synagogue, which we'll talk about also in a few minutes, and I was thumbing through one of the old prayer books, and I looked, and Rachel and Jacob Toledano had signed it in the front. So that kind of gave me a chill. We know they really were here, and there is Jacob Toledano's gravestone from the Sephardic cemetery on the south side. Now, as to why or how they came, I'm just going to point to one sentence, and then we can go to the next slide. This sentence says they opened a men's tailoring shop on West Washington Street. Okay, all right, so a tailoring shop, that's a clue. So one day when I was rummaging around at the Historical Society, I found telegrams from Kahn Tailoring Company, which was a huge tailoring firm located in Indianapolis. They hired lots and lots of immigrants, and they also were a nationally known company. They manufactured custom men's clothing and also produced uniforms for the Army, for the US Army in World War I and World War II. Now, Kahn was founded by an Ashkenazi Jew, Henry Kahn, who came from actually Alsace-Lorraine, and his family may have been the first Jewish settlers in Monroe County. He was born in Bloomington, but he grew up in Indianapolis. And he would send these telegrams to an organization, as you can see, called the Industrial Removal Office in New York City. That name sounds kind of ominous, but it was an organization that was founded by German Jews, and their goal was to disperse Jewish immigrants all over the US so that they wouldn't congregate on cities in cities along the East Coast, because they thought that would foment anti-Semitism. So Mr. Kahn sent this telegram saying, we are needing 4 or 5 coat makers to whom we will pay $15 and upward. And we know that many of the people who came from Monastir actually were in the needle trades. So we think that maybe that's how the first Sephardic Jews came from Monastir, was through the Kahn Tailoring Company sending these telegrams offering to hire them. And then, of course, like any other immigrant group, their relatives, friends, people from their home villages started to follow.
Gotcha. And I think we have another slide about another group that came, the Solana. I'm sorry. Am I
Please,
not very
it's hard to say. The Salonicles, I think is how we would say. Yes, the Salonicles that came from Salonika. Now, if you remember, I said they were very integrated into that city. They were a very important part of the economic landscape. And so they tended to not be in the needle trades. They tended to be merchants and small business owners. Now we have some very distinguished families that you may know the name of, even if you're not familiar with the, can you go back to that other one for a minute? In Indianapolis, Eskenazi and Mordo, they are cousins. And Mr. Sidney Eskenazi, his father and his uncle came from Salonika, and they founded the Eskenazi and Mordo produce company, which used to sell produce at the then farmer's market, like what we would know as the city market now. They were wholesalers. And then I guess at some point they also opened up to the public. Now we can go to the next.
Sorry.
That's okay. So Sidney Eskenazi, whom we all have great reverence for. He's done so much for the city. He's done a lot for IUPUI and IU. He's a great citizen of Indianapolis. We interviewed him for this project, and he actually told us some very poignant stories. He was, his father, David Eskenazi, passed away when Mr. Sidney Eskenazi and his siblings were very young. And his uncle Naphtali came to kind of fill that father role. And Uncle Naphtali was a very much a man about town. Here he is on the left from a newspaper article showing the produce from the produce company. He, on the right, he seems to be dressed as a cowboy with his friend Paris Namias. And I think I just saw Leah Namias from Indiana Humanities flash a message that that's her great-grandfather or something like that.
I would say shout out to the Namiases who are joining us tonight. I know there's a couple of you on tonight.
Definitely. And I believe Leah gave up that photo to the neighborhood of Saturday's project. But one story that we heard about Uncle Naphtali from a lot of people was that he was one of the few people down on the South Side in that time who had a car. And he used to load the kids up into the car and take them to a swimming pool that was in a Jewish community center on the north side at 25th and Meridian called the Kirschbaum Center. And that, many people, not just Mr. Eskenazi, but lots of people mentioned how fond they were of Uncle Naphtali and how good he was to everyone. So he was an important figure too.
Great. So the Sephardic Jews come and they kind of set up their own community centers here, right? As a lot of Jews did around the country. So what kind of places did they establish here in Indianapolis?
Well, the Sephardim didn't really, I suppose we could say they set up community centers, but I think the main organization that we want to talk about today is a building known as the Communal Building. Let's back up for a minute. Okay, no, let's go, you can go forward, sorry. Can we go to the slide after the base map?
Sure. Oh,
sorry.
No, you're good.
There we are. Okay, so Etz Chaim Sephardic congregation, its original this congregation originally met actually in the building on the right, which is known as the Communal Building. Now, this building is what we would refer to as a settlement house. It was set up by the Jewish Federation Welfare Committee in order to serve the needs of newly arriving immigrants. So it didn't only serve Sephardim, but there was a very heavy concentration of Sephardim who lived on the south side in the vicinity of the Communal Building. So they tended to utilize it very heavily. And they had the kinds of programs that you would expect a settlement house to have. They had citizenship classes, they had English classes, they had activities for the kids. They had, you could go in and get a checkup there or see a dentist on certain days. We heard stories about the dances. There were Sephardic Boy Scouts and Girl Scout troops who met there. So they had a full range of community activities. The communal building in the 50s, because of the demographic changes in the building, in the community, the building was sold to what was then called the Concord Neighborhood Association, and that became the original Concord Center. The building, unfortunately, is gone, and many people will know that the new Concord Center is over on the 1300 block south on Meridian. But if you interview the people who grew up on the South Side, and unfortunately there are a precious few of them now, we're very glad we did our project when we did about 10 years ago, because we were able to really capture some of those stories. They will reminisce very fondly about the communal building. And if you call it the communal building, you will be corrected. I'm just saying, just warning everyone, always say the communal building. And then Etz Chaim Sephardic congregation eventually got their own building on the South Side. This had been a Lutheran church. They were there for quite a few years, up until about 1964, I think. And then they moved up to a building at 64th and Hoover. And now they're in a beautiful building that was newly built for that purpose, just north of the JCC on Hoover Road. So I recommend that anyone who's interested in the Sephardic community and their history, take a ride up there, and you will find very hospitable people at the synagogue to show you around. That building is no longer standing because it burned down shortly after the Sephardic congregation moved out. Do you want to go back to the map?
Yeah, I love a good map. So
I love a good map too. There's nothing like a good map. And I have to thank Paul Mullins for really familiarizing me with these maps. But there's the Jewish communal building on Morris Street. And the original home of Etz Chaim is marked there at Church and Morris. That was a very densely populated area. A lot of Sephardic families, especially on Capitol, lived right, and Illinois lived right in the vicinity of those two institutions. There were also several other synagogues located in that neighborhood in the early part of the 20th century. There were little storefronts or even in people's apartments. There was one called the Peddlers Synagogue. There was the Russian Synagogue, the Hungarian Synagogue. A lot of them went by the national identity of the people who had migrated from these other parts of the world, the non-Sephardim, the Ashkenazim. When the synagogues started to merge together and move up to the north side, they lost that association with the people's places of origin. Only the Sephardic synagogue really still retains that connection to the original Sephardic settlers who came to Indianapolis.
Gotcha. So I know that as my grandmother had two rabbis at her funeral because she was an Ashkenazi Jew and she was marrying a Sephardic man, and kind of like when you might have both a minister and a priest maybe marry you, she had two rabbis to represent the two different communities. So they don't often get along. So what was that like here in Indianapolis?
Yeah, I'm surprised they got the rabbis in the same room. That's a good accomplishment.
Right. There's a lot of forceful will in my family, so, they made it happen.
Well, unfortunately, in every community, there's intra-community conflict within communities as well as between communities. And when the Sephardim came to the United States, they were regarded as kind of not authentically Jewish by many of the earlier settlers, many of whom came from Germany. And they were considered kind of a lower class of people. And they came and they did not speak Yiddish, which was the vernacular of the largest Jewish community at the time. So the fact that they did not speak Yiddish was a bit of a mark against them. So they were not readily accepted. And actually a lot of the Sephardim who were, or a lot of the Jewish immigrants who were resettled by the IRO, the Industrial Removal Office, were Sephardim because they referred to them as Oriental Jews sometimes, or Turkish Jews. And they considered them to be somehow a very different kind of community. In Indianapolis, we did hear stories about that kind of discrimination We heard about marriages that were discouraged. So your grandmother's lucky. I mean, we heard about marriages that were discouraged by the parents between Ashkenazim and Sephardim. We heard a story of one woman who used to work, who was Ashkenazic, and she worked at the communal building. And every night, a young man named Namias would walk her home. So he was Sephardic. I'm not sure which Namias it was. But she told us that this, probably if I go back to the transcript, we can find the first name, but a young man, Namias, would walk her home, and her parents did not like it one bit because they didn't want a romance to develop between the two of them. So there was a lot of that inter-community kind of, if not conflict, maybe not open conflict, but I would say maybe distrust or standoffishness. I would say that by the time the children of the immigrants were of marrying age, we talked to several people who had married Ashkenazim, and their parents didn't seem to be that perturbed about it. So with time, I think that kind of, those kinds of differences started to be less significant.
Cool. So I know that I want to make sure we share some of these great pictures, but I know that there were a lot of community gatherings for the Sephardim. So if I share this, can you maybe talk about when the chief rabbi of, was it Turkey, came to visit? Is that who this is in this, like,
yeah, you
dinner
have the wrong screen, the wrong.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, the image.
There we go. Let's try that again. Sorry,
This is
folks.
really like a happy hour, but we haven't been drinking, or at least I haven't. Anyway,
I have not started yet.
this was a big event. This photo that's in the center is 1922, and I guess it was the ex-Grand Oriental Rabbi was a guest at a dinner, and was hosted by people from Etz Chaim in the city, and that was, a really like a huge event for people. But what do you notice about that picture? It's all men, right? So we had definitely some gender issues going on, where the men were the ones who went to meet the Grand Rabbi. I think the picture on the right, to the right of that, I believe that's, I should have reviewed this, but I believe that's Gladys Cohen Nisenbaum's family. I recognize her father, Isaac Cohen, because he had that big bushy mustache. And she was the youngest of 11 children. So these are some of the children in the family before she was born. She passed away a few years ago now. We miss her very much. She was a big part of the project. And on the left, somebody who's on this call, I think will remember who that is, but I believe it might be a woman who is known as Tia Sol, Aunt Son. And, but somebody hopefully on the webinar will know about it. And the picture on the bottom is a picture from the annual Sephardic picnic, which has been happening almost since the beginning. It used to be down in Garfield Park when the community was concentrated on the south side. Then it moved up to Eagle Creek Park for several years. And then now it's at the JCC in the times when we can have picnics. And the man in the fez, who's kind of in the front, I believe that's Judge William, that's Judge William Levy's father, also Isaac. And there's a little recording there of people speaking Ladino, if you want to hit it for a minute and just let people hear it.
Sure. If I did this wrong, let me know and I will fix it so you can hear it.
Okay.
No estamos oyendo todo lo que están diciendo, por eso no estamos pudiendo participar. Hablaste de una con la mujer que estaba preñada, que metían una tijera.
Yeah, so I hear a lot of Spanish in there.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, if you're a Spanish speaker, you can definitely understand.
It always surprises me because I don't speak German, and so when people speak Yiddish, it all sounds like gibberish to me, but when I hear Ladino, I'm like, oh, I can get a few of the words here or there as you sort of go along. So we'll hear a little bit more. Maybe at the end, we'll get to some music so you all can hear some Ladino music. But let's talk about my favorite topic for anyone that knows me, is food. So we have to go there, right? And I am biased, but I think Sephardic food might be the best Jewish food. People will fight me on that. I know probably people in the chat are fighting me right now. But can you tell us a little bit about Sephardic food, or your favorite type of it, that you got to know as you were meeting the community?
Absolutely. I just want to go back for a minute and say that although I grew up Jewish, Ashkenazi Jewish, in a suburb of Boston, I had never encountered Sephardic people or Sephardic culture before. And the way that I learned about the Sephardic community is actually interesting. I learned about it actually from the African American community. The African American South Side community is a very, very tight-knit community, and still is, even though they were very dispersed by the construction of I-70. And they still come back to the South Side every year for a picnic on the first Saturday in August in a small pocket park, now known as Babe Denny Park. And so I heard about this, and I thought, this is a really interesting story about a community that still 40 years later is still coming together and feeling this connection to this neighborhood. So I asked people there, the very first picnic I went to, which I believe was in 2008, you know, why was this neighborhood was so special? What it was so special about it to you? Why do you continue to feel attached to it? And they started saying, you know, various reasons. I said, and plus that we had our Jewish neighbors. And I kind of said, your Jewish neighbors? What Jewish neighbors? And they said, oh yeah, our Jewish neighbors. We had the Malas and the Calderons and the Passo's drugstore, and, you know, all of these names, Namias, all these names. And I had never heard names like that before. And I was like, what kind of names are those? But I made a note of it, as anthropologists will, and jotted it down. And then through a very chance encounter, because this is always how the best things happen, is through chance encounters, I met Lee Mala, also of blessed memory, who used to have a little food stand at the farmers markets. And I began talking to her because I love Balkan food and Greek food. There's Lee Mala. And Greek and Balkan kind of food. So I went up to her and I said, this looks like, you know, Greek food. It looks like spinach pie, spanakopita, which many of us will be familiar with. And she said, well, yes, it's similar. She said, but I said, do you come from Greece? She said, well, my family comes from Greece, but we're Jewish. And all of a sudden it just clicked with me why people have these weird names, weird to me names, like Mala. And so I said to her, she started to talk about it. I said, by any chance, did you grow up on the South Side? And did you have a lot of African-American neighbors whom you went to school with? Because the school was not segregated on the South Side up to high school. And of course, many people will know what happened when kids got to high school age. And she looked at me like I was kind of psychic. And she said, well, yes, I did. So that was my entrance into the Sephardic community. And then I got to know about the food. And I have to agree with you, Callie. I mean, I grew up with, you know, my brisket, corned beef, you know, tzimmus. I mean, we love these things too. But I got to know about dishes that I had never heard of before. On the left, people were cooking at the synagogue one day at Etz Chaim in the kitchen, and I asked if I could kind of watch. And they were cooking a dish called fajones, which I think is the classic Sephardic dish, which is like a bean stew. And there's the recipe, but it's a recipe for many, you know, to feed lots of people. So you have 15 cans of tomato sauce. So they were making it for a big dinner for the synagogue. And then on the right, beneath the picture of Lee Mala, is a picture of the annual Etz Chaim bake sale, which I don't think happens anymore, which is a great shame, but filled with delicious pastries, many of which are made with phyllo dough, like Greek pastries would be. And Lee Mala described to the students about making the phyllo dough, how her mother would hand make phyllo dough, which I can't even imagine. We can buy it frozen. And she said you had to be a weatherman in order to make the phyllo dough because it had to be the right temperature. And she said, you know, you could raise a child in the time it took the phyllo dough to rise. And so Lee Mala was a wonderful, also a wonderful stalwart of the project, and told us a lot about food, and not just told us about it, but made it for us. So absolutely, I'm with you on the food.
We're going to get to your questions in just a minute, so make sure you're putting them in the chat or the Q&A box. But I'll finish up with my questions, Sue, by asking you about, can you tell us a little bit about this Neighborhood of Saturdays project? You talked about your students. So how did this sort of come about, and what did it result in?
Yes, the Neighborhood of Saturdays, again, it kind of, that project came to me. I don't know, it was a magical thing. It started out to be a project. I'm always looking for interesting studies or research projects for my students to do in Indianapolis neighborhoods. So it started out when I met the African-American folks, and the first family that I met was the Millers. And many people will know Ms. Pete and Beverly Miller, who's Ms. Pete's daughter, and another daughter of Ms. Pete is Jackie Bellamy. And she's the one I first met who told me that they have this annual picnic on the first Saturday of August. So the project started out to be it was called First Saturday in August. And it was going to be about the African-American community that had been dispersed with the construction of I-70. But then after I heard about the Jewish connection, I said to the Miller families and some other folks who were kind of our stalwart group in the African-American community, and I said, how would you feel if we actually brought in some of these Jewish neighbors, if we can find them and if they're interested? And they said, absolutely. So then it became a study of both communities and their relationship to one another between about, 1906, 1907, when the first people came from Europe. And really, at the post-war period was really when Jewish families started moving north. So it started to be the students in the classes. We did 2 classes based on this. Did oral histories. We did what we called scan-a-thons. I know you've put the link to our Neighborhood of Saturdays website, and people can go there and you can see tons of historical photos, people's personal photos that we scanned. And there's some other items there too. And we started to collect all of that material on the website. And then we decided to produce a book, and the students wrote most of it. And it is called The Neighborhood of Saturdays. Unfortunately, it's out of print right now because the publisher went under, but there's a copy on the website that you can look at or you can download.
We put that in the chat so you guys can
Right.
go read it from there.
Right.
I will say I have a coveted copy in my office that I give away begrudgingly.
I'm looking for a publisher. I think we'll republish it, or we may publish a second edition and kind of do something a little bit different with it, but we'll definitely keep it alive. So we called it the Neighborhood of Saturdays because Saturday referred to both the Saturday of the Jewish observance of Sabbath and the first Saturday of August picnic. So Saturday kind of had a meaning for both communities.
Gotcha. And someone did in the chat say that there are some copies in our local public library. So if you're in Indianapolis, you can reserve that copy and go pick it up.
Yeah, they're rare items now. So.
It is really nice that they digitized it through the IUPUI. Shout out to the IUPUI University Library.
Absolutely.
Go read it through there too. I will say that I got to know the project after it was done and the book was out, but we got to do a bus tour of the Neighborhood of Saturdays with some of the elders. And I tell you, Sue, it was a blast to go on.
It is a blast. And one of my biggest regrets is that we didn't film some of that stuff and record it, because most of our tour guides are gone now. We had an event once at the Concord Neighborhood Center, the current Concord Center, with young children who come from that catchment area, which is broader than what we refer to as our South Side. But some of the Jewish and African-American elders were on a panel with these young kids answering questions about the neighborhood. And it was really fantastic. And the kids' eyes were so big when they were hearing the stories about what it used to be like, and all the little small stores that were along South Meridian and so on. But I didn't think to take some of that stuff.
Yeah, I will say that what I remember about the tour is how much we talk about that food element, but how much for the two communities, the food was such a part of what brought them together, or the kids that would go to the Jewish household and have cookies after school. And that's really what stood out to me.
Absolutely. Food brings people together. There's no doubt about it.
So it looks like we have some questions in the chat and in the Q&A. So I'm going to start throwing them out at you, and we'll see what else comes in. So make sure you put your questions in for Sue. But there is a question about, we talked a little bit about how there was Sephardic and Ashkenazi synagogues, that they had their own. How did those religious practices differ?
Yeah, that is a good question, and I can't fully answer it, but when I go to the Sephardic synagogue, it's very unfamiliar to me, actually. Many of the songs that I know, because we sang them in my synagogue too, the hymns, they're still sung in Ladino. And there are various liturgical differences and differences in observance of holidays, but I can't really dig that deeply down into it, to say what they are. I just know there are certain things, like my family always thought this was interesting when I told them, like at Passover, when we all Jews avoid anything with leavening for 8 days, that the Sephardic Jews were allowed to have peanuts and rice, and Ashkenazi Jews were not. I think maybe that's changed now.
Well, I follow, it was as I understand it. This is how my grandmother explained it to me, so we'll take it from there. But like, I eat rice and legumes at Passover. You're not supposed to eat leavened products. And how I understand it is, as new foods kept coming in, they would ask the rabbi, "Hey, rabbi, can I eat this? Can I eat gluten-free matzah?" And some rabbis that were like in charge of Ashkenazi groups said, "No, you can't." And other rabbis said yes. And so part of that, it's also, I think, a part of what you're eating. If you take away rice, legumes, and lentils from people living in like North Africa, you're down to only a little bit you can eat.
Absolutely. I think those were staple foods in the Sephardic diet.
Right.
I think that's absolutely the case.
I think one other way I think about that question is, when I've been to Sephardic services, the music is always so different, and it's the same words sometimes, but to a completely different
melodies.
melody.
Yes.
And that always takes me by surprise. I'm like,
yeah.
Oh, we are doing
that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So there was a question if you've come across any evidence between Sephardic communities and Muslim communities in Indianapolis.
That's a really excellent question. And because in the Ottoman Empire, in the old days, there were close relationships between Jews and Muslims. But in our contemporary time, I don't really think so.
Mm-hmm. I don't know of any. But that's
I don't know of anything, yeah.
Good question to dig into more. I feel like there's a new research project for you, Sue.
Yeah.
Is this connected to why Shapiro's Deli started on the south side of downtown? Was it because it was close to this neighborhood?
Yes, it is. Shapiro's was one of many Jewish businesses that were located on South Meridian between McCarty and Morris, and some on Illinois, and quite a few on Ray Street. Terry's Market, I know people on this in the webinar, or I'm betting there are people, African-American and Jewish, who remember Terry's Market, which was at Ray and Capitol before the highway, and it was owned by a man named Al Hazen, who was Sephardic, who was very beloved, but his wife was Ashkenazi. So that was an early intermarriage. And the Shapiro family is Ashkenazi, but what we know as the footprint of Shapiro's restaurant now, what didn't always used to be the case. Shapiro's was smaller than it is now, and the other half of it that bordered on McCarty Street, McCarty and Meridian, that corner, that was Passo's drugstore, and that was owned by Al and Izzy Passo, and they were also very beloved members of the community. And as you can hear from their name, I'm betting they were Sephardic, but they had very warm relationship with Max Shapiro, who was the founder of Shapiro's.
Gotcha. And so these were kind of were these what kind of helped hold the community together with these businesses, would you say?
Absolutely. I mean, we had reminiscences from people who talked about on, Friday morning to get ready for the Sabbath, which would begin Friday at sundown. Their moms would send them out to the bakery. There were two Jewish bakeries on the South Side, Kraft South Side Bakery and Regan's, which was it's the Regan Street family. And people would go to the bakeries to get the challah for Friday night, and they would go, there were butchers, there were kosher butchers along South Meridian. There were little general grocery stores. So yeah, people walked to everything in those times.
And I take it all of this kind of disintegrates because the highway comes through. Is that sort of what you saw as the impetus for this community changing, or?
And that certainly was part of it. I think part of it, was the Jewish migration north after World War II. I think, if we look at neighborhoods all over Indianapolis or any other city, you'll find neighborhoods like that where there were the local I mean, even though I grew up in a suburb, we had a corner store my mom was always sending us to. Everything started to get replaced by supermarkets, which could be less expensive because they could use economies of scale. And the smaller stores started to get bought out or to die out. The next generation, the immigrants of any ethnicity, any part of the world, one of the first things immigrants often do is to establish small stores, but then often their next generation doesn't necessarily want to take them over. And so I think some of the factors most of them are not particularly unique to the South Side.
Gotcha. So if someone wanted to dig more into the Sephardic communities and learn more maybe about them in Indianapolis, other than picking up the book, what would you suggest they do or get their hands on?
Well, this is an interesting question because there is a history of the Jewish community in Indianapolis, but it has very, very little about the Sephardic community. And it's mostly a kind of institutional history. So, I mean, I think there is material at the Historical Society, which we really have only scratched the surface of. I think there are records there from the Jewish Welfare Organization that was part of the Jewish Federation that would probably have material. I think some of the historical material about Etz Chaim Sephardic congregation is there. There is an anthropologist, actually, interestingly. His name is Jack Glazer, who grew up on the South Side. And he became an anthropology professor at Oberlin College in Ohio. And I connected with him. And he wrote a couple of articles. I can send you information about those, and you can link those and for people. There are some really excellent books about the Jewish community in Salonika. There are 3 that I read that I can think of. There's not very much about the Jewish community in Monastir. It was a much smaller city, and therefore it was a much smaller population. But I have a friend from Macedonia who was working on that. Yes, I think Leonamius is posting about the University of Washington. Devin Narr is a great scholar, a young man. He came to Etz Chaim. I don't know if people on the line remember on the webinar, maybe like 2013, 2014. And he wrote a book about Jews of Salonika. I think it's called Jewish Salonika. And he runs a big center for Sephardic studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. So it is my goal to go and visit that center. I have met Devin Narr and I've corresponded with him a little. But I asked him once if he knew of sources on Monastir, and he didn't really.
I will say that I know we did back around the year 2000, did an oral history of Sephardic Jews in Indianapolis.
Yes.
Have to make an appointment to come, but come visit us at the Historical Society and check out the, check out those oral histories. And I will say, The chat has been, I've been keeping my eye on the chat, has been blowing up because I think half the people on here are cousins with each other.
Oh, that's so nice.
I'm so glad that you all were able to come.
Yes, I'm really glad too, and I can't wait until we can do this in person after the pandemic, and then maybe we can persuade some of the people to bring Sephardic refreshments.
And that actually brings me to, there was a question of, do you have a recommendation on a Sephardic cookbook that you really like? I don't know if you know one off the top of your head.
That's a very political question. But there is a very big Sephardic congregation in the Los Angeles area, I think actually in Beverly Hills. And I have a cookbook that they put out, a Sephardic cookbook that they put out. But I don't think it would be very easily available unless maybe we can scan it. Maybe we can scan it because it's probably not copyrighted.
My recommendation is always to start with Joan Nathan, and she usually
Joan Nathan, it's true. She is not Sephardic, but she does have Sephardic recipes in her book. I mean, to be very honest, when I want to cook something, if I don't already have a recipe that somebody like Limala or Limala's daughters have given me, I Google it. And there's a lot of websites where you can find, really good Sephardic recipes.
Yeah, and I will say, if you want to explore one way to see the big difference between Sephardic food and maybe Ashkenazi or Jewish food from around the world, look up haroset, which is a fruit and nut mixture that we eat on Passover. It's supposed to represent the mortar between the bricks. And that's a really good way to see how Jews eat and use products from around the world to eat the same piece. Leah says, don't bother with Ashkenazi haroset. My mom would say the same thing.
My best friend from college is on the webinar, and she just posted the name of a Sephardic cooking resource. So we'll have to gather all these out tomorrow, Lasky. And then Ashkenazi haroset, the haroset that I grew up with, it's mainly apples and walnuts. And first of all, I hate walnuts. And, I never really liked it that well. When I discovered Sephardic haroset, I never turned back. There's many different recipes for it, but the one that I like has dates, almonds, chopped orange. It's truly delicious.
Yeah, ours has dates and raisins and wine and like cinnamon and cayenne in it. Also, shout out to Claudia Rodin's Book of Jewish Food. That's also a great place to learn about.
I think that's what Tamar posted, and I'll have to look that one up because I have quite a few that I've gotten on eBay and various places, but I don't have that one.
So we're getting towards the end of our time, but I do want to ask you one more question before I toss it back over to Lauren. Can I ask, what are you working on next? What big project is coming out of Sue Hyatt next?
Well, this is the project that keeps on giving. And I'm really thinking that because there is so little written about the Sephardic community in Indianapolis, I'm just thinking maybe this is what needs to be my ongoing project. And I'm very grateful that we have the interviews at the Historical Society from 2000. We do have a nice archive of interviews that we collected around 2009 and 2010, because that generation is almost gone. We still have a few people. So I'm thinking maybe this will be my next project, is working more on these topics, writing something about con-tailoring and its role.
Gotcha. Well, I can't wait to see that. I'm all about it.
Yeah.
But we want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. And thank you everyone on the call for having such lively conversations in the chat as we go. I can't wait to share it with Sue after.
I can't wait to read it.
I know it's hard to read and talk at the same time. I'm going to toss it back over to Lauren to close us out. And then we'll have a little bit of music, I think, at the end before we go.
Because Sephardic music is also not to be missed. And thank you very much for having me.
Thanks
Hi, Lauren.
To Sue and Callie. And thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. I'm sure you've learned a lot. And as a reminder, all those links will be coming to you in an email tomorrow. So next week, September 17th, we're back exploring Indianapolis's evolving transit with urban planner Austin Gibble, archaeologist David Kling, and architectural historian Leah Connick. And keep an eye out for upcoming conversations on cemeteries, Kurt Vonnegut, wedding fashions, elections, and more. I just dropped a link to our upcoming calendar in the chat, but you can check us out at indianahistory.org. And then keep an eye out for other and more history happy hours on elections, cemeteries, wedding fashion, and so much more. Same time, same place, different Zoom link. We're in the middle of celebrating Indianapolis's 200th birthday. There are a lot of ways you can explore more about the history of the Circle City with IHS during this period. Saturday, September 18th, we open our latest You Are There, Indy Celebrates. Come learn more about our city's past at the Indiana History Center. Put on your trendiest mask and reserve your tickets today. Test your knowledge of all things Indy at our Indy Turns 200 Trivia Night. Assemble your team and join us Tuesday, September 22nd for a fun fight. And if we had a couple of people post in the chat about some family history, so come back on Saturday, September 26th, where I'll be teaching the first of a Genealogy 101 series about starting at your records at home to try and build out your family story. So sign up for that at indianahistory.org for more information about this and other virtual offerings coming to an internet-connected device near you. If you missed your chance to donate or would like to make a further gift to support the Indiana Historical Society, please visit indianahistory.org/virtual-resources-donate. Your donation will allow us to continue to share Hoosier stories. You'll get an email from us tomorrow morning with all these links and a survey included. It will take about 1 minute. We'd love to know what you thought and how we can make programs like this better. We'll post this conversation to the IHS video links in our website in the upcoming weeks. And we're sending you out with a little Sephardic music. Thank you, stay safe, healthy, and sane, and we can't wait to see you in the future.